This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, episode 656, recorded on August 21st, 2020. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today from Fort Lee, New Jersey, Dixon Despommier.
Hello there, Vincent.
Good
How you
afternoon.
doing?
I'm well. It looks a nice day out, isn't it, Dixon?
It's not so bad. It's a little bit hazy, but the temperature is very, very nice. It's about, I would guess 82 if I didn't have a thermometer, and I don't. And the humidity should be around 42, 43%, but I don't have one of those either.
You're close. It's 29C here in New York City.
Look at that.
Dixon, what do you mean a thermometer? Nobody carries thermometers.
No, I just do this. And then I stick it out the window.
Also joining us from Madison, New Jersey, Brienne Barker.
Hi, it's great to be here. It's 84 here, Dixon.
84. Well, you're in the heat bubble.
I am in the heat bubble, but pretty similar.
Yeah.
I think it'll be a nice weekend.
From
Absolutely.
Austin, Texas, Rich Condit.
Hi, everybody. 96.
Can't be nice. It can't be nice then. Right?
Well, it depends on your definition of nice. You know, it's 96, headed for 99. We got another week or so of 100-ish. Then I'm kind of hoping maybe it'll start to slack off a little.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Started
It's
to cool
okay.
off
Get out
here.
early. Everything's fine.
It started
What's
to cool
happening
off
to
here.
your COVID cases?
Oh, it's actually still trickling down just very slowly. I thought it was going to be actually leveled off, where the most recent new 7-day rolling average, moving average of hospital admissions is down to 27. Baseline
27?
before the spike was about 9 or 10.
You're talking about Austin or not? Not
Talking
the
about
state?
Travis County. Travis County, what is it? Municipal statistical area or metropolitan statistical area. It's 5 counties. Actually, yeah, it's more than Travis County. It's 5 counties.
So what's the whole state doing?
Oh, the whole state? Oh, man,
Yeah,
you're
right,
taxing me.
right,
Well,
right.
I can tell you.
Well, you got it in front of you.
Let me, well, no. I got
Let me finish introducing, okay?
I'm sorry.
okay.
I'm sorry.
So today is very special because normally Daniel Griffin and I record his report on Thursday night. I splice it on. But today he's with us from New York State. Daniel Griffin, welcome.
Hello, everybody.
So Daniel, you get a day off and what do? You come to TWiV.
You know, yeah, that's about
Fireman's
my
holiday.
wife's. That's my wife's expression. You know, this reminds me of I was with the family in Malawi, right? You know, and the family all excited. We're in Malawi, and one morning, you know, I've been there a day. I've got my my suit and my bow tie on them, and you know, my kid's like, "Daddy, what are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm going to work. I have this opportunity to work in the central Malawi HIV center, and I see like 800 patients a day, and I'm gonna spend the day." And they're like, "Yeah, of course, Daddy. Your idea of vacation."
Well,
Did you have your
welcome-
pith helmet
welcome.
on also?
I have to say that, Daniel, you may remember at the beginning of the pandemic, you would join us on TWiV from your car initially in the parking lot, and
Exactly.
then you joined us from inside, and then you ended up switching it to Thursdays. So
Yeah, it went through several iterations. So first I would be in the parking lot,
Yeah.
and then there was like a back stairwell, but then I realized there was like a gap in the door. And then it just got to the point where it's like, you know what?
I want to go in my car.
Record asynchronously and then
Yeah.
get patched in.
Worked
So, but
out.
it's nice to see everyone
Yeah.
because, you know, I watched TWiV and so.
Here we are. And we have 2 other guests today who are from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Lisa Smith, welcome to TWiV.
Thank you, Vincent. I've been dying to say this all week. It's 73 degrees and fair with rain.
There you go.
I've been dying. I blew it too. I've been so pumped to say that.
It's raining, huh?
You can try, David.
And also from Chattanooga, David Bruce, welcome.
Hey everyone, it is 73 degrees here, and we are Fahrenheit stuck in that.
73, wow.
It is rainy. I like Fahrenheit. You guys argue this a lot. I like
Yeah, we
Fahrenheit
do
because
too.
it's a much broader scale, and so I don't do Celsius. I do metric and everything else.
So today we have an unusual situation. We have 3 PhDs and 3 MDs on TWiV. Look at that. We're 50-50.
Wow.
And so
we're not.
Do I get to count in both because I have an MD and a PhD?
He
There's
does.
7
He
of
does.
us.
there's 7.
Right,
that's right. There's 4 PhDs and 3 MDs. Anyway, go ahead.
And I like to say, unlike Bill Nye the Science Guy, my PhD, it's real. It's not honorary.
Yes, it is real.
You have a functional PhD.
So David and Lisa have joined us, and they're going to talk about what they've been doing down there in Tennessee, and how they came to be here. I'll let you know later. But first, we're going to have our weekly COVID-19 report from Daniel Griffin.
All right. So let's start with our quotation. There are a terrible lot of lies going about the world, and the worst of it is that half of them are true. It's Winston Churchill. So let's go through a couple things. I heard the CDC director, Robert Redfield, issuing a stark message this week, said basically follow recommended coronavirus measures or risk the worst fall in U.S. public health history. And sort of reminds me of the Christmas story where I think we're being given a choice, like we can follow all these measures or this is what we can expect. So it's in our hands. Transmission and testing, I always try to leave this out, but I just can't because I always get questions. I try to take a week off, but as my wife will tell you, yeah, that just doesn't happen. I'm on the phone and conference calls and submitted a paper and working on a second. But a majority of Americans say that a negative test result should be required before returning back to work or school. And many school boards are not really interested. And I've actually been in dialogues here. And part of the issue is they say, we don't have the budget. We're already strapped. And where's this supposed to fit in? So I've been in a lot of talks with parent-teacher associations, teachers associations, and really just sort of bringing up the option for, give your students, give your teachers and staff access. The school doesn't have to pay for this. They don't even have to orchestrate it. Just coordinate because there's a lot of programs out there. According to the poll that I based this on, it was the Morning Consult where they say 73% of Americans say COVID-19 testing should be required for adults returning to work or students returning to school. Only 16% opposed mandated testing for the students. About 17% opposed it for employees. So it's sort of similar. Most Americans have a sense. I think they're drinking the flavored drink that testing is a way to make things open more safely. And so, this all really started actually. My front load part was a pro-health physician COVID update. So to discuss pro-health program, and a lot of this is sort of a tri-state pro-health and Riverside required listening. But just to discuss, we have I call it the Tri-State COVID Testinator Program. So some people who might catch that reference. ProHealth's got a different name. They're calling it the Let's Get Back program. By tri-state, this is New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And this is all about trying to use testing to make a safe reopening of the economy and a safe reopening of schools possible. And I like to point out that end this is not a partisan issue. I think we all would like to be able to earn a living, and we all of us, as much as I love my children, I would love them to have the opportunity to be out of the house more often than maybe will happen without this. And there are a couple acts. I mean, there's the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which passed on March 18th, and there's the CARES Act, that's the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which really make COVID testing and associated services no cost to individual patients. And that's supposed to be the issue. So if you're getting charged for any of this testing or these associated visits, speak up, because that's not supposed to be going on. So we've actually created a guidance for our tri-state physicians on how do you do testing and which test when. And so I'm going to sort of cut to that and then back. So what are the different testing options? And I try to make this simplified. People have heard about PCR testing, right? And this is classic PCR, the original CDC FDA protocol. But there's also other ones that fall into the same hat. The Hologic Panther, which is a transcription-mediated amplification protocol, which just allows for faster throughput. But this is all basically your PCR level testing, sensitive down to a less than 1,000 RNA copy number, really sensitive beyond the infectious period. But there's testing delays, there's resulting delays. We've got ours down in the New York area to about 24 hours or so. But in a lot of parts of the country, it is more than 8 days. It's up to 13 days in certain places. Adding on to this are some of the isothermal amplification technologies, such as Abbott ID Now, which uses a nicking enzyme, or NEAR. So it's a nicking enzyme amplification reaction technology. And some of the others, this sort of the cutoff is down to about 4,000 or 5,000 RNA copy number. These are a little quicker, right? Some of them very quick, like the Abbott ID Now in minutes. Still, again, your sensitivity is down way past infectious levels. And then we get into antigen testing, BD, Quidel, and nice news this week is a UK company with Lumira DX got approval. And these are still down to about 50,000 RNA copy number. These are actually pretty rapid, right? These are minutes. This is picking it up well below outside the infectious period. We're actually looking at a reanalysis of the famous Seattle data with the anterior nares, where you might be about 3 different CT cycles. So instead of 50,000 with the antigen, you might be a sensitivity of 50,000 if you really sort of do the math on that. And then serology testing for prior infection. But we all sort of are in the school where it's going to be 1 million, 3 million, maybe 5 million RNA copy numbers before people are in that infectious period. So as far as our guidance on using the testing, because we're rolling out in this, as I call it, the Testinator program, widespread access to rapid testing. But then, of course, we have backup with the PCR type testing as needed. And we suggest the Abbott ID Now. We're going to have hopefully multiple machines at all of our 50 tri-state centers. We're going to be coordinating with businesses and schools, getting results in less than 15 minutes. We estimate that this technology picks up greater than 99% of infectious cases. So that's pretty darn good for pulling infectious people out before they enter these spaces. The rapid antigen test, this is actually interesting. BD was who we were contracting with, but the US government has actually, for the moment, agreed or decided they will purchase all the BD rapid antigen strips. So that's a bit of an issue. I think it's great that the government has jumped in, and you can see someone is buying into that paradigm. But for those of us readying ourselves to be using those, there's going to be issues with access. Those we view as really great ways of picking up rapidly infectious cases. We were talking to one of the inner city schools, right? A lot of people, if you have a turnaround, you may actually have trouble finding and connecting with that student or that individual who got tested. So there's a lot of advantages to this on-site rapid testing, whether it's done at an urgent care center, at an office, at a mobile clinic, which can be set up. And we still have a lot of these nucleic acid amplification approaches. So in-house machines, such as the one I mentioned, Hologic Panther, or the commercial labs, Quest and LabCorp. And we say that these are very sensitive for picking up infectious, but probably overly sensitive. So it's going to pick up individuals even past this infectious period. So we're basically saying, as far as what tests should our providers be thinking about, if someone comes in with what we think is acute disease, then we anticipate they're going to have high levels of RNA. Any test is going to pick that person up. If they have a negative rapid test, it seems highly unlikely to us that this is actually going to be a person whose symptoms are explained by the acute COVID. However, there's the clinical judgment, the phases we talk about. If the person says, I've been sick for 10 to 14 days and we're really seeing a cytokine storm presentation, they may have low levels. And so those people are going to really be best served with the nucleic acid amplification testing. So sort of putting this in line as we roll out our Testinator program guidance for our clinicians. But let me go back now to something I promised. I gave everyone homework. I don't know if everyone here did their homework. I hope all our listeners did their homework. I see Dixon. Dixon never does his homework. That's okay. Back on. I think we muted him, I hope.
No, I give homework. I give homework, Daniel. I don't take it.
I remember a lecturer out in Minnesota, and he was talking about tests. He's like, I don't take tests. I give them.
Yeah, exactly.
But I had talked about a prior TWiV, episode 606, where I talked about the different approaches for how we learn and how we decide what to recommend as physicians. And so I want to talk about this because there was an article that came out, and a lot of people asked me about, what did you think about this article, the COVID wars, that set, doctor versus doctor. And it actually, just to give people context, is sort of, who may or may not know me that well, it reminded me of a skit when I was a teaching attending. And I was actually a teaching attending for one of the ICU doctors that I'm working with now, and they basically do this skit where they make fun of sort of your different teaching style, shall I say? And the skit was about one of the attendings was grieving because Steve Jobs had died. And he was in his office and he wouldn't come out, and the other attending was like, "Oh, there are these pamphlets we have here," and I was explaining how important the pamphlets were, and my role was I come on stage and say, there's no evidence to support the use of pamphlets in depression. So it goes back a ways that I've always sort of embraced the evidence-based guidance for us in the clinic. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about what I think we know and sort of the basis for that. So presentation and clinical course. And I feel like this is solid ground, right? We've seen millions of cases now, and we really have I think a good understanding of a first week being a viral phase, a second week being what a lot of us refer to as a cytokine storm phase. There's of course discussions about is that the right terminology, but understanding that this is a time where we're seeing significant immune pathology. A third week, which really overlaps where we're starting to see the clotting or the hypercoagulable phase. This fourth week, when we're starting to see an increased risk of secondary infections, and then this tail phase, which we're learning more and more about as time goes by. And a big thing is, how did we get here? How did we get that knowledge? And you can actually go back to, I'm going to suggest that this was really, I think, a productive, fruitful dialogue between people who are researching and publishing and people who are on the ground seeing these things. So back in January, end of January, there was a Lancet publication, Clinical Features of Patients Infected with 2019 Novel Coronavirus in Wuhan, China. And this publication I really thought was great. It started to report patients having fever, having cough, those with an identified exposure. And for the first time, we start to hear cytokine storm. We start to hear D-dimer, procalcitonin, lymphopenia, IL-6. There's even a mention of steroids and remdesivir. This was good and bad because in a certain way, it gave a narrow perspective on the clinical presentation. A lot of people took away from this, 98% have fever, 76% have cough, the majority have an exposure. So those are the only people that we need to worry about. So sort of this narrow lens. But by mid-February, we actually we start to get a little bit more of a clinical experience, and we start, I should say, realizing that the clinical presentation can be a bit broader. And the nice thing is, as the clinicians are seeing this and reporting this, you get an article that comes out of Wuhan, China. It's a retrospective cohort study, also published in the Lancet. So, clinical course and risk factors for mortality of adult inpatients with COVID-19 in Wuhan, China. And this, for me, was the beginning of where we start to see the phases that we now talk about. You see the first week of fever, cough, malaise, generalized viral symptoms. The second week, you see the immunopathology. And then you actually even see in here a discussion early on about secondary infections. And buried in here, actually, doesn't get a lot of attention at the time, but they basically say 50% of the non-survivors have clotting issues. You're again hearing about lymphopenia, IL-6, D-dimer, procalcitonin, ferritin, and other inflammatory biomarkers. And we're actually starting to see, if you look in here, and among clinicians, use of steroids, despite, to be honest, WHO recommendations against this. And this is nice. We're starting to get a nice dialogue. We'll talk about the not so nice stuff going on behind the scenes, but I think this is nice. We're also getting data on the viral dynamics. And I remember Steve Goff sharing with me the publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, SARS-CoV-2, viral load in upper respiratory specimens of infected patients. This comes out in, March 19th. And this really started to go along with the idea that a lot of us were discussing, which I think will later be fruitful, that the viral replication is starting early. And by the time we're seeing that cytokine storm, that immunopathology phase, the viral levels have really dropped by then, really to barely detectable, perhaps below infectious levels. And actually, right about this time, Christian Johnston's publication, right? Virological Assessment of Hospitalized Patients with COVID 2019. And that really suggested support for the concept of phase 1 is viral symptoms, and then phase 2 is more of an immunological response. And I have to say that it was really critical for clinicians to have these publications to refer to have their ideas, I think, refined by. But at this point, we start having the early skirmishes in the COVID wars. These were not clinician researcher skirmishes. These were clinician skirmishes. There were certain clinicians that had ideas about who should be tested and were, I'll say, employees of large decision makers that were controlling those tests. There also were clinicians that had certain ideas on how patients should be treated. So you actually started having some conflicts between clinicians saying, I really am concerned that my patient has COVID, but limited number of tests. So these gatekeepers were in this really not great situation of saying to their colleagues, their friends, sorry, we only have 2 tests per hospital. You're not going to get one of those 2 tests for this patient. I'm going to allocate it to a couple others. So that sort of starts a little bit of a conflict, sort of an us and them, right? You know, us who are like looking at our patient one-on-one and advocating, and then other people saying, you know, it's kind of a public health crisis here. We don't have a test for everyone. And at the same time as this is happening, those of us who are seeing, you know, hundreds of cases in the outpatient setting and the urgent cares, we're seeing that full spectrum of cases and really saying we need more testing, where a lot of the quote unquote test gatekeepers are, you know, siloed in the hospitals and they're only seeing critically ill, very sick. They're not seeing, I think, the full spectrum. We then move into another conflict. And again, this is not so much researchers quite yet, but people are starting to see the clotting complications in their patients and starting to ask questions. And there was a nice story was captured in the Scientific American about this, where I was actually on the one of the medical wards with a bunch of the hospitalists. And I still remember the story where they basically were saying, we are seeing a lot of patients. We think they're all having clots. We think they're all having pulmonary emboli. But it's really hard to get these people scanned because the radiologists, they don't want to die. They don't want to get COVID. They don't want us to send all these patients down for these angiogram studies. And actually coordinating where we send 8 of them down and 7 of the 8 have massive pulmonary emboli. And then I remember the conversation happening. What do you guys do? What are we going to put everyone on blood thinners? And they were like, well, we should talk about that. So this was starting to create a very interesting dynamic where you were seeing things that we felt like we knew how to treat from other diseases, but yet you're starting to get the question of, well, we need to study these things. But at least I'll say there was, I think, a nice dialogue between the clinicians and the other clinicians and the researchers and the people publishing that I think really helped us define the phases. And so I feel good about that. But now I'm going to get to the second part. I don't feel so good about this. And the reason I put this in this initial physician part of TWiV is really the physicians and the researchers. I'm going to suggest if we work together, we can have a more productive next few months of this pandemic. And so I think we all would agree, or I think there's a lot of suggestion that COVID-19 patient care has rapidly improved. And I think that if a COVID-19 patient is admitted now, their chances of survival are much greater than a person admitted in March. But this is interesting. Why? Because we don't have a lot of randomized controlled trials, right? And we sort of went into this, and I think we went into this, and I went into this with the idea that we will have better patient outcomes when we have those randomized controlled trials to guide us. So what are we doing now, and what are we basing it on as far as therapeutic? So mechanical ventilation. We moved from intubate early to avoiding intubation if possible. And in a challenge in the early days was we had a very limited understanding of this disease. And one of the first things we observed was that when we did intubate a patient, put them on mechanical ventilation, they seemed to get acutely worse. And so, we had limited resources. So, and you also can't intubate everyone simultaneously. So we'd have one patient that we would say, let's intubate this individual. And we would do so. And then suddenly their support requirements would shoot up. Their inflammatory markers would acutely rise. And the person maybe next to them that we just hadn't gotten to intubate yet would actually sort of kind of putter along and maybe stabilize and maybe not intubate. And as we know from some of our publications early on, the people that got intubated, it was a minority of those people that ever ended up making it out of the hospital. So there weren't a lot of randomized control trials. And actually, there still aren't randomized control trials helping us. There was a cohort study, feasibility and physiological effects of prone positioning, right? We've talked a lot about prone positioning, putting people on their belly. Not compelling in the literature that this is making a huge difference. Institutional guidelines, right, were put early on where they said you've got to intubate these people early because if you don't, there's going to be huge exposure risks. But then you had those of us at the bedside, right, who would see this individual and we would care just as much about them as they might be, our daughter or our mother. And we would say we want to now avoid intubation because we're really concerned about the harms. And so there was a bit of a back and forth here. So I will say we've moved in a direction here, but we did not really get the randomized control trials, and I'm not sure how we would get them. This is sort of that parachute analogy people talk about. It seems to us very obvious that delaying intubation resulted in improved outcomes. And again, it's going to be hard to get anyone to do trials where you take half your people and early intubate, old standards, and then you take the other half, use new standards. I think we just sort of moved in this direction without randomized controlled trials. The next I'll hit on is antiviral therapy. And I call this from the kitchen sink to just remdesivir. And this was honestly a very difficult time. And I know I've shared some of these experiences on past TWiV episodes. But there was really a significant change, honestly, in how bedside decisions were being made. In the old approach, your physician would look at the available options. Maybe they would discuss with consultants, and then a decision would be made. But there were committees at a lot of institutions that were not just producing guidelines, but really enforcing order sets. So you would see order sets that were really just a bunch of clicks. And so a committee would decide that everyone should be on azithromycin and HCQ and vitamin C and thiamine, et cetera, et cetera. And basically, the order set would come up. And this was created by a committee. I could never find out who exactly was on the committee when I would ask. But it really made it very easy for people coming in to click, 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 click down the list, and your patient was now on the kitchen sink. And then if, let's say, a prescriber had the audacity to start steroids, these committees actually had individuals who would go and discontinue the steroids. So it was a very, very interesting time. And there was a bit of an issue too, because you had people early on, and I think we saw a lot of this sort of therapeutics playing out in the press, where people believed very strongly that they knew what was best for their patient. Now, the challenge, right, was 1 week they felt very strongly that every one of their patient needed to get hydroxychloroquine, and if it wasn't given, then it was unethical. And then they quickly moved to no one should get HCQ because getting it was unethical. And from 1 week to the next, when you were trying to do randomized controlled trials, and I know sometimes I get accused of being part of the deep state or being partisan. But whatever side this comes out on, I actually set up 2 randomized control trials. And when I set them up, there was this huge input. We've got to find out if this works. This could be a game changer. And then once the trials were set up, either people didn't want to enroll in the trial because they were sure HCQ worked, so they want to be in my trial, or they were sure HCQ was going to kill you and they didn't want to be in the trial. And they didn't want their patients in the trial. So this actually created a real impediment to getting people in randomized control trials. And so at the end of this, what do we have? We did end up with the randomized control trial supporting remdesivir, but no statistically significant mortality benefit. It looked like in a certain group of patients, there was a shortening of the hospital stay. It's a limited window. Maybe it does a little bit. And this was a trial with over 1,000 patients. So I had a fellow graduate student when I was getting my PhD who basically said, if I need a statistician to tell me something works, I would like something a little bit better. So we have remdesivir. Let's go on to immune modulation during the cytokine storm. Here, from never use steroids to using them for patients requiring oxygen or ventilatory support as the standard of care in most settings. So this was interesting, and this was covered a bit in the Times article. But there really were a lot of conflicts here, and I mentioned the pharmacy gatekeepers, where early on, if you put your patients on steroids at certain hospitals, those steroids would be discontinued by someone who felt that the patient should not be on those steroids. And she actually had physicians at the bedside thinking they were seeing a dramatic impact of steroids. Probably true. We now realize looking back. But then when they would rotate to a different hospital, they would see their orders discontinued. Or as we see in the New York Times article, they might be berated by a physician who would say, you're putting your patients on steroids. You're killing your patients. What are you thinking? So actually we're shouting matches, physician against physician, rather than, I should say, discussions. And even when we ended up with the randomized control trial, the recovery trial, as we see in the Times article, you even have people saying, well, that's just one well-controlled randomized control trial run by the leaders in the world. But, another one might come out showing something different. So I'm not sure we should all jump on that. So that, I think, left a lot of people frustrated. They said, we finally actually got a randomized control trial. You said that's what we needed to have, and now you're telling us that, that's still not enough. So immune modulation, here we are 6 months later. As we've talked about in prior TWiVs, we still don't know the role of a lot of other immune modulation now that steroids are becoming sort of a background therapy. What did the other therapeutics show in that background? Now I'm going to jump to anticoagulation. And here we also moved from one extreme to another, from never use anticoagulation to increasing use of full dose anticoagulation, right? And so that has become the standard, right? So someone comes in early, they get remdesivir, they meet the right criteria. If they require oxygen or a ventilator, they might be on steroids. Anticoagulation, universally, the guidelines now and the practices are putting people on anticoagulation. But I have to say, this again is this horrible parachute dilemma in many physicians' minds. A lot of them feel like because they saw so many clotting complications, if they don't put their patients on anticoagulation, putting them on nothing would be unethical. You'd be withholding anticoagulation, so to speak. And this is actually where there was a lot, I have to say, of conflict that occurred. The steroids, there certainly was a lot of conflict there. Anticoagulation, there was a lot of conflict. And I'll quote a couple of my colleagues. One was, this is strong words at Columbia, but this was an ID doc at Columbia who said, there seems to be a bit of bad behavior among the researchers. And then I have another out at one of the community hospitals who was speaking about one of the researchers who said, and this for him, who only says nice things about other individuals, who said, quote unquote, he is not a very nice man. So I'll say that the researchers quoted the New York Times article had slightly stronger criticisms for the clinicians. I think witchcraft was a word that was used at certain times. But, the tough thing here is we think the patients are doing better. We do think that the incidence of thromboembolic complications is lower. But is this due to delayed intubation? Is this due to steroids? Is this due to less of those kitchen sinks therapeutics? Is it due to a lower census, a lower age group, less ill patients? And, here we are. And I sit on one of these anticoagulation guideline panels, and I'm really kind of disappointed in how limited we are as far as having randomized control trials to guide us. Recently had a person that I know well who works at one of our hospitals who ended up in the intensive care unit with COVID. And she was really struggling. And we had this conversation. Looks like she was going to be heading towards to death, actually. Her D-dimer was up at 13,000. I think I mentioned this on TWiV. She was on full dose anticoagulation. Nothing seemed to be working. And we actually gave her a higher dose of steroids. The next day, the D-dimer was at 3,000. So this was sort of an interesting sort of moment for me to think about. Are we making her better by interfering better in an inflammatory cascade? A D-dimer is telling us about uncontrolled inflammation, or is it really anticoagulation that's critical here? So I'll go into superinfections next, and this is the time when we see how much harm we may have done. I think I mentioned that early on. Some of the steroid using physicians were yelled at that they would be killing their patients. And so the warning was that if you messed around with steroids and other things that impacted the immune system, you would see dramatically higher rates of blood and fungus, bacteria and fungus in the blood. And all this would come back and you would realize that you killed your patients with good intent. Fortunately, we haven't seen that. So that's a little bit helpful. But as a recap, so here we are in August 2020, nearing the end of August 2020. And what have we got? So we have some people wearing and supporting face masks. The men always tend to have their nose stuck out. We have better access to testing. We have physical distancing. We do understand the clinical course from acute to the tail and all the wide range of presentations. And I think this was a cooperative success. This was people communicating. I think this was information going back and forth. We have remdesivir, which is something. We have steroids, which are cheap, which is fantastic. So this isn't something that only certain people will be able to afford. They seem to make a difference if given to right people at the right time, but we're still learning about dosing. Does that mild person on 2 liters of oxygen need the same amount of steroids as someone who's on a ventilator? We're not sure. We do have anticoagulation. Not only in the hospital, but also people going home on this. But we're still working on dosing. We're still working on patient and agent selection. And we're still really limited as far as guidance from the literature. So I think in the New York Times article, they talked about how both sides felt a little bad. The researchers maybe felt bad about their choice of words, but a lot of the clinicians felt a little bit bad about here we are in August and we still don't have randomized control trials. So I guess my sort of request to all the clinicians that listen to the early part of this is that we don't know. And it's very hard to know unless we can cooperate and communicate effectively with our research colleagues. I saw the frustrations on both sides. I saw the frustration at the bedside, not really knowing what it was that would help patients and seeing things thrown at patients that seemed to me to be harmful. But I also found the frustration as a researcher setting up these large randomized control trials, which are not inexpensive and take a lot of time, and then seeing basically the back and forth, 1 week a certainty, 1 week, the other week a certainty the other way, but never that certainty that we need that knowledge to help us guide patients. So I think we're well into the pandemic. Many of us on both sides have regrets, and I think I mentioned early on the MD and the PhD. So I'm 1 foot in both camps, but we still don't have the guidance that we would like. And I think people have been passionate, and I think they've been driven to do or to stand up for what they feel was right. But I think this is one of those times when maybe we should all step back and be a little bit humble and realize that in medicine, it's very complicated and it's very hard to know what the right thing is without the science and without the studies to guide us. So I'm going to finish there. I'm going to remind people to keep helping us out. We're trying to support floating doctors down in Panama. And as mentioned, they're having a really tough time. And this organization I've worked with for years goes out to all these little indigenous villages, and they are little. and you sleep in tents and it's 110 degrees and you're covered in sweat, and every day you're setting up these mobile clinics and you're working with these wonderful individuals. But, in America, we've put on 15 pandemic pounds. In a lot of these areas, the people have lost 15 pounds. They're starving to death. And this organization is really helping to try to bridge that gap to supply food and medical care to these individuals. So help us. Go to parasiteswithoutborders.com to donate and help us to support these fringe disenfranchised individuals. So thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. All right. We actually have some email questions for you. We have some topics to discuss, but you're going to stick with us. So let's speak with Lisa and David. So a couple of weeks ago, I got an email from them. And as I said, they're in Chattanooga, Tennessee. They're surgeons there. And when their elective surgeries stopped, they decided to do something, and they got involved with their community and all sorts of activities. And the last line of the letter was, "See, Vincent, it can be done if you put your mind to it. Let us on the show. We'd love to share our community's experience." And so I said, come on down. And here we are, Lisa and David. Tell us about what you did down there. It's all yours.
Well, David and I married almost 10 years ago. We have 2 girls in high school, 2 boys, one in college and one in the workforce. And he actually had a physically distanced, smaller than previously planned wedding in our front yard in June. And my parents are 80 and 84. And when this all started, we had so many different things to think about and talk about. In February, we took the whole family to Disney. We went to my pediatric surgery fellows reunion. We sent our daughter on a school trip to North Carolina. And in another 2 weeks, the WHO was declaring a pandemic and the president declared a national emergency. And heck, we'd just been to the Auburn, Tennessee basketball game. And so we started seeing the pictures come in. We were canceling our cases. The committees were forming at the hospitals. And worst of all, this crisis of PPE was the center of things, at least for us as surgeons. We saw that, and we saw the people in the trash bags. Daniel, I don't know how much you can tell us about that. And I don't know if I would have wanted to be there then. I didn't want people I knew, people I cared about, to actually try to figure out how to protect themselves. And we didn't know much about the disease at that time. And we knew specifically in Tennessee, from our command center at the county hospital, we had minimal supplies.
Lisa, that was, I was going to jump in on that. I mean, a lot of that stuff that I talked about, I think on the last TWiV is, a lot of the journalists wanted to get in and see that. But a lot of the hospitals were in sort of a protective mode because that's the last thing you want to see. Is, oh my gosh, you go into this hospital and you've got, doctors and nurses. And there were facilities where the nurse would be like, oh, why don't I give you, I'm going to take off my protective gown and lend it to you. And the doctor would be, what are you doing? No, you need that. You're having all these exposure. I think there was one hospital where they gave out some sports event ponchos. No, that was just an extra treat. And you're like, yeah, but there were no PPE. So yeah, that was what you expected us to use. So yeah, in New York, it was much worse than was ever seen in the news. But the hospitals and, a lot of doctors in our area, a lot of nurses work for the large hospitals. So there were unfortunately basically gag practices occurring, and people who broke ranks were basically taken aside and spoken to.
Well, we didn't have much here in Tennessee as far as those warehouses. The president talks about his, but goodness, we'd had a tornado just a few weeks before the national emergency. It destroyed a big warehouse that TEMA had up near Nashville. Cardinal Health, it also had a recall, so we didn't have a bunch of that. And so we really thought, we know how to do this kind of stuff. And I'll turn it over to David to tell you our next step.
Well, what happened with us, we realized that there was not enough PPE out there. We are not the type to sit back. Our practices had been cut in half. Basically, we worked in the morning and we were told that we needed to go home in the afternoons. And 95% of what I do is elective surgery. So I was unable to do surgeries anymore because that had been shut down. And Lisa and I've always volunteered, and we had someone call us. It was a friend of a friend, and it was a manufacturing company in Hermitage, Tennessee, which just is outside of Nashville. And they actually made carpet inserts for cars. And they have a machine that's called a Gerber machine, and it's like a CNC machine for fabrics. And he calls and he says, hey, I want to make booties. And I want to make face coverings. And at this time, a lot of people were starting to make face coverings. And I said, what I'm seeing, I know what we're missing at the hospital is our gowns. And if you can make a gown, then I think it would be helpful for us. And he said, well, I don't know how to go about doing that, but I'll do anything. I want to keep my workforce. He had 20 employees. I want to keep my workforce employed, and I want to help this out. I want to help this country out. And so Lisa is a junior seamstress by trade, I guess, that and surgery. And she actually fashioned a gown. And actually, literally, I called her in the middle of the afternoon. And by the time I got home, she had a gown on a Hannah Montana doll. And she has that doll. I know that the listeners can't see it, but
Nice.
That is the doll. And she literally had fashioned this gown. And I told the manufacturer, I said, hey, let's just meet halfway. And so we met between Nashville and Chattanooga. It's about 150 miles. We met halfway, literally at a truck stop on the side of the interstate. Lisa had mocked up a gown. She had this Hannah Montana doll, and she chose that because apparently it's anatomically correct. And apparently Barbie is not. But so she chose this doll. We took it up, and literally the next day, we meet him again on the side of the interstate. He has mocked up a gown. And by the end of the week, he has given us 50 gowns for us to take into the hospital, which we took into the command center at the hospital. And with that process, they're now manufacturing around 1,200 to 1,400 gowns a day in that facility. And they've actually added 20 employees to that workforce. And to my knowledge, the biggest contract that they've received is about 1 million gowns at one order. And so going forward with that gown development, Lisa is involved on social media. I am not. And she posted this Hannah Montana doll, these gowns, and all of a sudden, literally it blew up. We had manufacturers reps. We had other manufacturing facilities calling us saying, how can we help? We want to make gowns. We want to make face coverings and things such as that. A group out of a nearby town actually made surgical vascular drapes, and they called us and said, we have ability to make this. We have fabric. We can make anything. And we realized very quickly, as Daniel will allude to, we didn't have enough N95. We were literally given one N95 mask to live the week with, or even 2 weeks with. And so we knew we needed to protect that N95 by putting a cover over it. And so this couple actually manufactured face coverings. We met them. I've got one of those, the early days. We met them also at an outdoor restaurant and went through this. And this face covering was used to protect our N95 masks. And they very quickly manufactured about 2 million for the Tennessee Emergency Management Network. And again, it kept growing. Another company reached out to us, a local company that actually makes the little cardboard containers that you guys get shrimp in. If you remember the little red and white ones, you might get a hot dog in or get shrimp in. And they said, hey, we have ability, we think, to make a face shield. And I looked at Lisa and I said, I'm going to drive over and see what it is they've got. That I can't imagine a cardboard face shield is going to be that great. And so I've got original prototype here. This is it. It's a cake box. And so he shows this box. As you can see, it's a square cake box with a cutout for where you can see the cake. And so I put this thing on my head. I'm like, I don't think that's going to work, but you guys can do this. I know you can. I said, have you ever been into a donut stand and worn the adjustable, hat? Or maybe the Burger King crown, with adjustable. He goes, we make those. And so the next day, literally, he puts this shield in my hands. Wow. And it's adjustable. And as you can see, it's cardboard. It has a frost-proof layer on the outside, which is actually something they use for cakes so that you can still see the cake when it's in the freezer. And immediately I was like, you got it. And I'm literally talking to the CEO of this company. It's Southern Champion Tray. He said, if you tell us it will work, we can make $8,000 an hour. And if it really works, we can make $24,000 an hour. And I was blown away, literally. And he said, not only that, he said, we can probably do it for less than 20 cents a shield. And I realized, this company's fantastic. They actually partner with Samaritan's Purse, and they shipped thousands, hundreds of thousands of these to Samaritan's Purse. As you know, there was a field hospital in New York that was in the park, in Central Park, that they had actually put up, and they shipped thousands of these, hundreds of thousands of these to them. Lisa and I literally carried boxes of these to the hospitals for supplies, put them on the loading ramps, met so many wonderful people along the way. And in the process of doing this, I'll turn this back over to her because I don't want to take too much, but in the process of doing this, these manufacturers reached back to us and said, hey, we need to know how to keep our employees from getting COVID-19.
And that was the challenge, because after meeting all of these really cool people, and you're kind of stuck in the hospital, and you do your thing and you do your job and you take care of your family, and you're kind of in your own lane. And finally you meet these people, and they're not far from us. And not only are they working when everyone was under shutdown, they were truly essential. All the food delivery that was going on, all this stuff, all these things needed to happen. And they said, help us, because here's the page on the CDC website about how we're supposed to come to school or come to work. And all the kids are home from school, and we're just trying to keep above water. We were able to translate those words for them into everyday behaviors. Basically, we started looking up products, looking up the recommendations, and we felt that since we were surgeons and we scrub our hands and we put on our gowns and our gloves, we cover our hair, we've got our goggles and our mask, we transmit nothing, at least we hope we don't, to our patients in the fashion that surgeons have done for over 100 years. And we felt like we could really teach people. We teach med students, we teach residents all the time. And so we can teach people how to do that. And we actually started instituting doorway health checks at that time. And we told each of these companies to designate somebody to be their health officer and to start checking people as they come in the door, make sure they're doing okay, make sure they're not sick, make sure they've not got a cough and fever, because we wanted to keep these factories working. At the same time, we really developed a positive relationship with local media, both radio and television, as well as print, so that we can continue to be a level source of information for that sort of information for our community, and kept things going. And then we found out that a colleague of ours was doing something similar. And David, I'll let you tell that part.
I'm involved in a physician-directed network. Basically, we try and take care of companies and the health of those companies. We actually instrument the Student Health Organization, the health of Purdue University, one county government in the state of Tennessee, as well as our local electric power board. And so Lodge Manufacturing is a manufacturer. If you guys have ever had an iron skillet, Lodge Manufacturing probably made it. And Keith Helton, who is one of my partners in One-to-One Health, he had basically drawn up a protocol to help those workers at Lodge Manufacturing. And he called me and he said, "What do you think about this protocol?" And I said, "That's really cool." I said, "We just did this for this manufacturing group up in Hermitage, Tennessee, in one of our local manufacturing groups." I said, "We should pool our resources." I said, people don't know how to go back to work. Some people have to go back to work and be in the workplace, but they don't know how to do this safely. We do this every day as surgeons and go in and out of our buildings and see patients and do it in a safe manner. So we should be able to teach those people, the lay people, how to do the same thing. And in so doing, one of the local senators, actually U.S. Senator Bob Corker, is actually a friend of the organization, and he has a lot of ties, a lot of friends throughout Tennessee. He let other people know, one of which was Pilot Flying J. One is a large disability insurance company in Chattanooga. Said, "Hey, this group of doctors can help you guys get back working." And so with that, we went out and met these people. We put nurses on the ground and helped them actually go back into the workplace in a safe manner, and did phases of return, of which we've never gotten to that phase 3, which would be full return. And Lisa, you were very involved with Pilot Flying J, so I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Well, that was the first big group of people we worked with. And when Senator Corker introduced us to Jimmy Haslam and his senior leadership team, I mean, what a terrific company. They were keeping our fuel moving during the pandemic. They were covering their costs, covering their quarantine, making sure all the gas stations and truck stops stayed open for us. And then they had a leadership team in Knoxville, and they developed a return to work task force, which they ended up, I think the final name ended up being Return and Refocus. And we still work with them. I would say that several times a week I'm in contact with them. But he basically was very forward thinking and said, we're not back to work yet. We're all on shutdown. Only this essential part is running. How are we going to get back to work? You're going to have to open your minds. And these people are going to teach us how to wash our hands and open the doors. But in all reality, that's what we did. We taught them how to get out of their car, get into the workplace, take personal responsibility for their workspace, get there, put on their headsets if they were in the call center, how to take care of their the food they were going to eat, how to work together, how to have meetings, split it between virtual, start to decrease the density in the rooms. We looked at all the rooms in their facility. We did a lot of work with them, and we kept replicating that same sort of process as we work through the rest of our community with the smaller companies we worked for. And at this point, we're now, and I'll go ahead and run down a short list for you. We've done small to medium local business as well as these giants. We've worked with the local business organizations and done Zooms with them. So all the small business, the 2, 3, 4 employee businesses have access to these. We've consulted with a large bike rally that was mentioned on TWiV previously. We've done consults with multiple large and small universities, including Duke, UTC, and UTK, 2 county school districts, 2 private schools, a bunch of allied health organizations, the local physician practices, our own medical society. We've tried to figure out our upcoming Veterans Day parade, which is the longest running one ever, and we'd still like to have it in some fashion, as well as daycares in our county government. I think that's a pretty comprehensive list.
So I just want to jump in here just for a second and say, Tennessee, the state of Tennessee is known as the volunteer state. And you're the poster children for that saying. You are the biggest volunteers I've ever heard of coming from that state or any other state for that matter. You've worked a miracle. It's not a miracle, obviously. You're sharing your humanity with everybody else. And why doesn't everybody else want to do this? And it's just so puzzling. I'm so inspired by what I've just heard. And I know that if you were from Louisiana, it'd probably be the same, but coming from the state that says the volunteer state, how could you resist?
I was going to jump in, Lisa and David, and you bring up, I think, a really interesting point. I mean, surgeons are obsessed with not getting their patients infected, right? If you think about the whole surgical theater, this is where we know mask wearing goes back a really long time, hand washing, all the rest. And you guys are, Lisa, David, surgeons are experts in how to control potential infection. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that you're leaders. I mean, surgeons are regularly monitored for what's the rate of post-op infections for a different individual. It gets flagged if it's above a certain amount, and then there's a whole root source analysis. How can we intervene? So I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think it's great that you guys could really jump in with one of the aspects of your specialty that is so applicable to COVID-19.
Well, I guess the neatest thing, sorry, honey.
I really appreciate that. There are a lot of people out there, if they know how, will help. The thing that we ran into, these companies are fantastic. We have a company that literally makes carpet inserts for cars who wants to keep their employees going. And they're making thousands of gowns, level 2 gowns, so that it can protect our workers in the healthcare profession. The shields, who would have thought a cake box company could make a face shield that actually works? Our nurses love it. They love this shield. It doesn't fog, which I know, Daniel, you have to deal with all the time. Those regular face shields that you will wear, they fog terribly. This one does not. And it's just because of the way it's been treated. And it's something that in the future will be used by many emergency management networks because it files flat. It lays flat, and 250 fit in a box about this tall. just 6 inches tall. So it's a wonderful thing. But there's just so many people out there that we've run into. I feel so blessed to have met people in the workforce that I never would have met before, just because of what's happened with this. And I'll tell you something else. We meant to say it, TWiV 591, and that was Ralph Barrick's TWiV. I love podcasts, and I put down a book literally as this started. And I was looking for something else because I was driving back and forth and doing this. And I was hooked immediately from Ralph Barrick on. And Lisa and I haven't missed one since then. And one of the things that happened with our protocols, we were so into fomites. You got to clean your surface. You got to do these things. And then Kristen Drosten's on and says, wait, no. This is droplet and aerosol based. And literally we had to pivot our protocols completely. This is way before, the CDC talked about it. And of course, Vincent was so on it very quickly. I'll never forget. I put it in my phone. I have quotes in my phone, which I'll share one later. But he said, it wasn't about this, but he said, they're going to kill us all. They're going to kill us all. And I'm literally, Lisa's just, what are you laughing at? Because I literally couldn't stop laughing when he said that. But, it's just the CDC has to test everything. And Lisa and I are trying to digest all of this information from multiple sources all over, just so that we can formulate a protocol going forward and trying to help. It's easy to say shut down, but some companies really do have to open back up, and they need guidance, and they didn't know what to do. And that was just an opportunity for the two of us. And quite frankly, we didn't have anything else to do because we couldn't practice after noon.
The trickiest thing was to get the folks who keep their little beverage at their meetings and they want to continue to drink, and we want them to not eat or drink together.
Yeah.
And I think everybody's dealing with that now in the restaurants. And I finally looked at this woman. I said, look, if I'm going to take out your gallbladder, if I get thirsty during your operation, what would you like me to do? Do you want me to just pick it up and have a swig? Or do you want me to say, I am thirsty, and leave and take a drink and scrub back in and continue your operation? Or maybe it's not the Sahara. I'm going to make it to the end of the operation without a drink. She's like, point taken.
Well, Daniel,
you could always get a beer hat.
Absolutely.
No,
Daniel,
what you guys did was really great, because I think a lot of people get frustrated because they don't know what they can do. And if they don't know what they can do, they don't really feel part of the solution, and then it becomes frustrating. But it sounds like, Dave and Lisa, you really got a lot of people involved, and you gave them the opportunity to be part of the solution. And, and when you feel like you're part of the solution, you're more likely to wear a mask. You're more likely to social distance. If you feel like I'm just sitting at home and I can't do my job and I can't do anything helpful, it starts to get frustrating. And I think what you have modeled here is tremendous. If more people could do this, if more people could reach out and help others make a difference. And it sounds like even businesses, you created ways for businesses to make product and stay open. I mean, this is tremendous.
Yeah, being a surgeon, just to reemphasize that one fact, everybody knows that surgeons have to worry about sterility all the time. So you're the voice of reason that everyone will listen to. Nobody will doubt you because you're in the operating theater, and whatever happens there is your fault or not, depending on how careful you are. And so why wouldn't they listen to you? But they won't listen to a lot of other people. That's the problem. So the entire football team at Auburn, as you must have read by now, got sick, plus one coach. Now, I wonder how they caught it. I'm not going there.
So, Lisa and David, this is not everything. You did some work with schools and testing. I want to hear about that too, because that's amazing.
Well, I'm going to let Lisa. Lisa really takes the lead with Purdue, but early on, as school was letting out, so May is happening, school's starting to let out, or what would have been school letting out. Of course, everyone was at home. A lot of the schools, I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I do sports medicine. I walk the sidelines of two of the private schools in Chattanooga. They're actually rivals, but how I've been able to do that is something unto itself. But I've done it for 22 years with one school and 13 with the other. their administrators actually reached out proactively. They said, we want to develop protocols to get our kids back in school when fall gets here. We need your help. And Lisa was taking the lead with Purdue. I was much of a secondary role with that. I'll let her talk to you about that, because we started our Purdue return around May to June as well.
I'd say, and the Purdue relationship is really rewarding because it's so complementary with what everything else we do, because a university takes staff and people to run it, the housekeeping, the cafeterias, the maintenance crews, and then you have the students as a whole different picture. And this is tens of thousands of people involved. And the medical A team got developed, and they were really running it in place when One-to-One said, we need one of you guys on the medical A team. And it's run by David Broker, and he's just become a master at running the committee and getting the tasks defined and accomplished. So we had everybody test to come back. We have protocols for mitigation and for the TETRAS, the testing, tracing, isolating. They partnered with Rutgers to get all the testing done because of the massive volume of kids that were going to need tested. And a lot of other universities were requiring testing as well, and doing tests on site through their vet school. And we've got plans in place to do this pooled testing, figuring out how to get the regulations and how we're going to actually get a reasonable PCR to run with a couple of different swabs, and talking about, is it going to be 4? Is it going to be 5? How many can we pull and still have reasonable surveillance results? And then we also developed a symptom scorecard that we have in the clinics. And, it's just one of these, and nobody really has one of these yet. But what they wanted to do was actually start scoring the symptoms so that we could track this very special age group where we have tens of thousands of young adults. And the relationship's just so rewarding because it's giving back to our other consults, and we feed into it with our experience. And it's been fantastic. And it has a lot to do, these testing and these serial protocols where we're testing these kids as they come back to and attend college in surveillance, to what David's doing here in town with our 2 schools.
So is Purdue going to be the gold standard for university behavior?
Ooh, wouldn't that be cool?
That would be very cool.
It's really awesome. And they have a Purdue promise. And one of the things I noticed on Twitter 2 days ago, because I do follow their local newspapers, was that as part of their Purdue pledge, they weren't going to have large house parties off campus.
Wow.
And there was a large house party off campus at what's called a co-op, where some of the people work and run the house as part of their rent. And in that co-op, they didn't follow the rules, so they're suspended.
Yep.
And I think they mean business, and I think they're driving the point home that if y'all want to come to school,
right,
and let's do school.
Here you go.
So David, I'm interested in how you implement an appropriate testing program for, I don't know what you're dealing with, elementary schools, private schools, high schools in the community. What can be done to help schools put together an appropriate testing program?
Well, the Michael Mena's, Lisa, you guys will like this name. She calls it Lick-a-Stick, the rapid test. The monoclonal antibodies on the stick. I think that's a great name for it. Until we have that, we are left with the resources that are available to us. The schools that I'm speaking of are actually 6th grade through 12th grade. So there's a middle school and an upper school with these 2 private and boarding schools. It's Baylor and Macaulay School in Chattanooga. We have kids from all over the world and all over the country that board, and also local day students that come to this school. Baylor School has 2 PhD virologists actually on campus that are lecturers and teachers, and they're employed and work for Baylor School. And there was a $15 million endowment, which private schools actually have these kind of endowments. And lo and behold, they had purchased equipment some year ago that would allow them to do RT-PCRs on campus. As a matter of fact, at one time during the pandemic, they were doing up to 750 RT-PCRs literally at the Baylor School campus. And so it gives them a unique opportunity because we can actually turn those tests around in about a 2 to 4 hour period. Currently, the way it's working is that we're testing in the morning, and then by that evening, 6 p.m., the results are being propagated. We can't test everyone. I mean, ideally, you'd want to test every kid coming to campus that day, and either if it's positive, you go home. If it's negative, you stay on campus. We don't have that, but we are doing a procedure where we test and we isolate necessary students. We tested every individual right before they started activities, literally 3 days before school started. And there's a plan going forward to spot test to see if there's an issue on campus. I mean, if we
They're
need
going to be testing 20% on a weekly basis. It's a rotation, so they've got a scheduled rotation to test about 20% of people, and then more with the higher risks, and that'll keep the volume manageable.
What do you estimate as to the cost per test in that system?
$100.
And Lisa, at Purdue, same question. What's being done for testing? How's it implemented?
Well, what's being done right now is that everybody had to show up with a negative test, and it had to be within a certain range of time for them to arrive there.
And it's their responsibility to come up with...
It was their responsibility to come up with one before they got there. And then there is a serial testing program in process right now being developed. And we kind of went back and forth with it last Monday, but we're hoping to move from testing mostly athletes and high-risk people to serially testing batches of kids. And like I said, we're going back and forth between the 4th and 5th. Or 4 or 5 per test.
So has school started yet, or
kids are back on campus? They're not all there yet. We did have a nice group.
I'm curious as to whether you have any numbers as to how many kids could not come back because they tested positive. How many people did this screen keep from arriving on campus?
I do have access to a lot of numbers. I think the best thing I can tell you is that the prevalence was just under 1%, and it was very manageable. And I think going forward with a serial testing program to be able to figure out where the clusters are and where they're happening, and the protocols that we've come up with, who you test when you find a positive one, are really going to allow us to cone in on it, because some of that testing, 1,500 a day tests, will be able to be done there on campus.
How many students are we talking about?
40,000.
Over 30,000.
Do you know what the test positivity rate is in the area? Of course, the kids are coming in from all over the place, I assume. But
yeah,
like I said, it's just under 1%.
Yeah, that's Tippecanoe County.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because in Texas, we're dealing with, I just looked it up, it's been bouncing around because they are... there's reporting issues, put it that way.
Data hoarding.
As of today, a 14% positivity rate. So I don't know how you can manage that at all.
It's
just
too high.
Stay home.
Yeah, it's too high.
So, David, do you have a feeling for how you can make this test a lot cheaper so that it could be more versatile?
Well, they're not the RT-PCR. I think that the reagents involved and the equipment involved, and plus the laboratory personnel just to run it. I think you maybe could get it to $80 a test, but what we've done at the other school, Macaulay School, did not have that on-campus testing. And as Daniel was telling us on TWiV, testing is going to be a problem. We realized that 20 million kids were going back to school. We also realized that the NFL had a plan on Wednesday to test fans, and so that on Saturday they would get a golden ticket to go to the game on Sunday. And they had partnered with Rutgers University, and so they have this this sputum test, RT-PCR sputum test at Rutgers, and we realized we're about to run out of tests. At that time, LabCorp and Quest in Chattanooga was literally taking a week and a half. And so I told the administrators at Macaulay School, I said, look, guys, we're going to be in trouble. We need to be able to test. We're going to be in trouble. They were very proactive. They went out and purchased at my advice, Sophia 2. So the Cadell testing, which is the lateral flow rapid antigen test. which we have incorporated. We've had it on campus for about 3.5 weeks now. And so we've been able to use it. We ordered 1,000 tests on the front end, and those tests are costing about $50 a test. And our next series of tests will be about $40 a test. And we hope to get it down to around the $25 range. The nice part about that is it also allows our infirmary to screen for flu and strep, because they're cassettes that are on the same piece of equipment that you can screen with. And we found it to be invaluable. I didn't really want to get into it, but we had a huge spike that happened in Chattanooga following the graduation parties. I think Daniel alluded to this, but everyone delayed graduation till midsummer. And so these kids had these very nice socially distanced graduation parties. And then afterwards, they had parties with their parents, and then they had the after party of their parents' party. And then all of a sudden, all of these kids are turning COVID positive. And so it literally crept into our return to sports. Luckily, we were testing, we were isolating, we were doing symptom checks. And so we were able to identify a huge cluster, and we were able to isolate them away. And they just now are getting to return back to the athletics as this turns. And interestingly, from this, and this is really cool for me, so we had a lot of positive kids that I've had interactions with, and I know the names of every one of them as far as the schools are concerned. The overwhelming symptoms that they had were body aches and tremendous arthralgias. We only had one kid with a fever over 100.4. Most of them had a temperature of about 99. Two kids had loss of sense of taste or smell, but we really had to glean that later. It wasn't something they reported to us. The last thing, maybe a few with a productive cough, but rarely did that happen. And I hate to use it this way, but a smattering of diarrhea with the kids as a symptom that was there. Of the ones that were symptomatic, 55% of the kids, and I've got at least 100 that I know of positive, 55% were symptomatic. The other 45% were completely asymptomatic.
So you're in. I'm sorry, Rich. I just wanted to say one thing. You're in a unique position here to check whether or not their athleticism has decreased at all from when before they caught it, because everybody knows how fast they can run the 100. So it would be a great test to see how fast these kids can run the 100 or the 40. Either way, depending on the sport. But you can test, and you can publish this in Nature. I'm sure you could. Because the lesson here is that if you're an athlete and you want to make your living doing sports, do not catch COVID-19. Do not catch COVID-19.
I agree completely. And I will tell you that we actually have instituted a cardiopulmonary return to play. So any COVID positive kid that comes back, just like we do with concussion management, we have a cardiopulmonary return to play. It's very similar to what the Blackhawks use currently. And so we actually do a cardiopulmonary challenge to those kids. If we identify a problem, they are segregated out, sent to their physicians to be worked up before we let them go back out on the athletic surface.
Yeah.
So you're using one of these lateral flow antigen tests in pretty big quantities. Do you double check positives with PCRs? Do you have any idea about? Do you have any feeling for false positives, false negatives, sensitivity in a practical sense from what you're doing?
I do. The first 20 we did check, and they were all accurate on both the negatives and the positives. We could not afford to go past that. I felt like a positive kid did not need to be checked. The CDC does not recommend that. And the negatives, if they had persistent symptoms and we were concerned about them, we did check those, but they remain negative. So
another question, this goes to both, actually to Daniel to some extent, about these tests. All of the antigen tests now, and that includes BD and Kydell and the Luminar DX. These are all immunofluorescence tests. Am I correct that they require a machine for the readout? Number one, and number two, are they all for nasopharyngeal swabs?
David and Lisa, you guys are using the Quidel. So how is that going? You have the machine that it goes with it.
We do. It's very similar to any machine you would check flu or strep in your office with. The Sophia 1, and now this is the one that's replaced that, and it's a nasopharyngeal swab. And we have 3 nurses that man our infirmary at the Macaulay School that actually instrument that test.
Yeah, and the BD is the same. There's a little machine. It's called the Veritor machine, and it's the same system we use for flu, RSV. And basically, it's going to be a swab, middle turbinate swab. It's supposed to be goes into a little 1 ml vial, and then that goes into the little well. And it runs. It's like an 8-minute, and then it gives you, and it's good and bad, right? I mean, we all want that home pregnancy test you look
Sure.
at, but I don't know if anyone spent time in a lab. I always love like when they're doing the Western blots for Lyme, and the person's holding it up and say, "What do you think? Do you think that's a pop?" I'm like, "Come on, really?" This is going to be your judgment whether that's negative or positive, and so it is nice to have the objectiveness, but then the negative side of that objective machine reading it. Is the throughput issues, right? Because, it's 8 minutes. It's only, it's in the machine for, a very short period of time, that actual reading part. I mean, the main is the lateral flow minutes.
Okay.
But you need those machines. Now, those machines are like $300 a machine,
Okay.
so you can buy thousands of those. And then you could really address the throughput issue.
And
I haven't seen the Lumira system yet, but I assume it's the same. But
well, I'm looking at the website, and it's an immunofluorescence test, and they have a little machine. So,
okay, so
I assume that's the same. And I assume that it's a nasopharyngeal swab, but I don't know that for sure.
Yeah, I think it is. The one thing that's a little different, I think Lisa mentioned that what's in process is the AuraSure, right? And that's actually going to be much like the HIV test, where you're going to have a little thing that sticks out. So this will be a true lick stick, and you'll either, suck on that until it gets moist, or you'll swab, the inside of your mouth or something. And that's going to be nice from, hopefully this is a CLIA wave to the point of home-based testing where you do it yourself. And there are ways actually, right? As we all know with Dixon can speak to this as well, with like malaria and blood smear testing, where you can have little iPhone apps where you use the camera of the iPhone, and there's like a code. So you do your iPhone to basically document that this is a fresh test you're about to do, and it's not contaminated because you don't want to share from your neighbor. And then so many minutes later, you put it under the camera again, and now you're going to get your green code for the day or not. So there's technology to allow it, unlike the Western blot where they're holding it up in the light, asking me if I think it's positive or negative, which I don't like, to something that's a little bit more objective and validated. Because, if you're going to let this person come into a classroom or a business or wherever, I guess that sports stadium, which just frightens me. We want to know that they're really negative before they go into that setting.
The machines that process the antigen test, they do one sample at a time. Is that correct?
So they do.
Okay, and you said it's about 8 minutes in the machine.
Yep.
Something like that. Okay. Yeah, actually, as you were describing the sports fan, it occurred to me what a marvelous incentive and opportunity to screen a whole bunch of people who otherwise would be out partying.
What do you mean otherwise?
I mean,
it's called. Are you kidding?
Yeah.
That's the tailgate party before the game. But Lisa, I have a question for you, and that is, if you succeed in convincing the powers that be that Purdue University is COVID-19 free, that includes all their sports teams as well. Who the hell are they going to play? Because virtually nobody else that Purdue plays will adhere to what you're doing unless they all chip in together. And when you add up the amount of money that the NCAA sports revenue generates for the universities at large, I got my degree at Notre Dame, so I can tell you that that's everybody's university except the people that hate Notre Dame, of course. But it's billions of it's in the trillions of dollars. And $100 a test for every football player in America done twice a week is chicken feed. I mean, that's absolute nothing. That's a shoulder pad replacement. That's a water bottle. This is a ridiculous situation to find ourselves in this late in the season. I mean, I know that there's a controversy now between the Big Ten and the Pac-12 and all these other SEC and all the others, they're going to lose billions and billions and billions of dollars for hundreds of dollars a test. That's absurd.
And you hit the nail on the head.
So who's saying that? Who's saying that? Come on, Lisa, get going. I want my gains.
I think about the coolest thing about Purdue is that they were one of the two people in their conference that said, we don't need to cancel the season. Remember, they're canceled. But what they said is we need a delay. Everybody is still getting their ducks in a row with this pandemic. And just like the feeling that we had, like, oh my God, we got to hurry up and get over on the interstate and meet this guy and have this gown made. Everybody's going, oh my God, we have to hurry up and manufacture all of these tests and get these tests and get a protocol done and God bless, committees take time.
Wow.
You know, you're talking to a surgeon who, if you have appendicitis, I can get you to surgery and take your appendix out. But if you have a problem to solve with the committee, you have to kind of have someone. And David Broker's doing a great job in Purdue driving that bus.
Welcome to
but
academia.
There's still.
That's right. Now go away.
So I had another sort of miscellaneous curiosity question about the gowns. Do they need to be sterilized? And if so, how do you deal with that?
That's part of the process that's still going on. And so the goal of the initial gown was, since there was no material to make a gown with, if you got stuck and thought you had to wear a plastic bag, you could actually go into the OR. There weren't cases going on anyway, and get a surgical drape. You could take that surgical drape, cut it, and put it on and wear it. That's what the pattern was designed to do. And that's why it can be stamped out on the Gerber machines. Yes, these gowns can be sterilized, but that makes it a level 4 gown. The initial gown that we did was a level 1-2, and some are now a 2, and it's because of what is covered and where. And the main part of the gown was designed to be able to go in and protect yourself, because that's really before we knew you really only had to do source control with the COVID positive people instead of treating the whole world like there was asbestos in the air.
Can you define what you mean by level 1, level 2, or level 4? Because I usually think about biosafety levels, and I'm pretty sure you're talking about something different.
It's the levels of designation for the gowns that allow them to be used in medical facilities. And they're very fancy and specific from our federal organizations. And the level 1 gowns don't have to be impervious. They are simple protection, and is just like any other criteria. The level 4 gowns go up and they can be sterilized, and they are impervious, and they will last so many hours under so much pressure of so much water. And there are testing for all of those fabrics. And, like most surgeons, 1 is light, 4 is heavy. So that's about what I still remember.
I was as curious about the manufacturing facility and the delivery of the gowns. You want to make sure that the gowns are delivered in a fashion that they aren't going to carry some sort of pathogen into your facility. Is that an issue?
Well, Rich, you know that this virus dies in less than 24 hours on a surface, but it's packaged like this. I know that that everyone can see it. That's how the gown is actually packaged. And it's spun bond PP, which is a polypropylene product, which is what our drapes are currently made of. Surgeons would be very familiar with Halyard 600. That's a spun bond PP as well. And it's autoclavable. So if you imagine, if you've ever been in an OR, instruments come wrapped in this blue wrapping. That blue wrapping is spun bond PP. And so it's autoclavable. And so, yes, you can process and autoclave it. And it will support a column of water 30 feet high. That's how impervious this gown is.
Wow.
Polypropylene, my father is spinning in his grave, but that's another podcast. He was in on the early days of polypropylene development.
So if that's the case, then can't these be reused by simply autoclaving them again?
We have, yes.
Sure. Absolutely.
So Lisa and David, what you have described, I hoped that every place in America would be doing. I'm certain that they're not, but I hope you can inspire some others to do that. And I think it just shows it can be done if you put your mind to it. This is an emergency, and it requires unusual actions, and you've done it. So
I am just in awe. Thank you so much. This is amazing.
This is better than Michael Minnis talk.
I just,
you guys are great. You're our journal club, and we actually can't do this without you because it takes that whole village, to take care of things. We can't imagine, what Lister had to go through. I mean, he was crazy for not allowing people to smoke in his observation deck. But Chattanooga is a really cool place.
It is. You're right. Absolutely.
We've handled the Woodmore bus crash. We've had 10 Ironman events. We've had the ISIS shooting, and we have this network of folks that we work with, and everybody works together here. And we fortunately have a county mayor who's really gathering us all together and really trying to continue to move forward, because there's a lot of work to do. There's hygiene theater happening. There's confusion over the quarantining.
Theater.
Hey, we got that from you guys. And,
I love it.
And we've just had a lot of experience.
We're in Act 3.
Yeah, I think Daniel said hygiene.
Do we make it all the way to Act 3 yet?
It's a Greek tragedy, actually.
I was due to visit Knoxville in October, but they canceled it. And it's too bad, because if I were going, I could come visit you. I was actually going to do a TWiV in Knoxville, but we'll have to reschedule it in a couple of years. I'm curious, Lisa and David, where are you guys from originally? Lisa, where are you from?
I'm from near Pittsburgh, the suburbs outside Pittsburgh.
And David?
I grew up outside of Auburn, Alabama, and Opelika, Alabama.
And where did you go to college, David?
I originally was going to Boston University, and my father said, we could afford Auburn a lot better than we could Boston. And so I ended up at Auburn, and it was terrific. I was actually a microbiology major.
Mm-hmm. It's a good school.
I worked with Dave Worley. You guys might know him. He's a biochemist, and he's the guy that actually put the bromide filters all over the world. I worked in his lab for 2 years. A wonderful man. He never took a salary. Donated all of his money back. I literally took $1 a semester when he was working. He's still there as a professor emeritus.
You have a good vet school too, as I recall.
My brother's a veterinarian, and he graduated from that program as well.
Oh, it's a wonderful place.
And where did you go to medical school?
University of Alabama in Birmingham.
And another great school.
Some good virology there as well.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I furthered my education at University of Tennessee in Chattanooga as orthopedic residency.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with Dr. Jack Houston, who's the father of sports medicine, in Columbus, Georgia, and Dr. Champ Baker. I did a sports fellowship, and then I also did a pediatric fellowship in Salt Lake City, Utah, with Sherm Coleman and some terrific surgeons out there as well.
Cool. Lisa, where'd you go to college?
I went to the University of Pittsburgh and worked in the neurosurgical labs there, and thought I was going to grow up and be a neurosurgeon. I matriculated to med school in Philadelphia, so I went to the other side of the state to Hahnemann University, and they thought I thought I wanted to be a heart surgeon, but I ended up by accident interviewing in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and doing my residency here as well, like David. And under Philip Burns, I ended up really liking it here. I did my pediatric surgery in Miami under Charlie Lankow and Kathy Burnwhite, and it was Kathy's retirement that I went to in February, which was my last airplane ride. And then I came back here and joined Dr. Burns's group. It's a 34-member multi-specialty surgery group.
So this is 1-to-1, is that right?
1-to-1 Health is a health management organization. And
could you describe that? The website looks pretty interesting. Describe the sort of the philosophy of 1-to-1 Health.
I'll take that. So about 7 years ago, one of my partners, Keith Helton, had this idea that insurance companies were basically controlling the world. And his thought is that physicians can direct care better than insurance companies can.
Here. I love this. Go for it.
And so
I like the posturing. That was really good.
I became the chief development officer. And basically what that meant is I needed to go handpick doctors that we felt were like-minded, that had the physicians. The direction was that we would have the patient's choices coned down into doctors that we would choose ourselves, so that we could guide their care, lower the cost of that care because it was guided, and give the benefit to the patients as basically a kickback and a reduction in their copays. And so we marketed this to multiple companies, and they actually ended up taking care of Purdue, ended up taking care of Electric Power Board in Chattanooga, several other manufacturing companies, several counties, and things such as that. And so the network is about 28 to 30,000 lives that we take care of through that physician-directed network. And the whole concept is that we want to provide the employees of these companies and these counties with good health care. We don't want frivolous tests run and things such as that. So we chose a network of physicians that were like-minded with us.
Good for you.
That's great.
That's just awesome. I love it.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, guys, Lisa Smith, David Bruce from Chattanooga, thanks so much for joining us, and congratulations. Great job.
Thank you, Vincent. Do I have time for a quote?
You bet.
The most difficult thing is the decision to act. The rest is merely tenacity. The fears are paper tigers. You can do anything you decide to. You can act to change and control your life and the procedure. The process is the own reward. Amelia Earhart.
Oh,
good one.
Great.
Lisa.
This is awesome.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Lisa,
guys.
for coming.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
Thank you.
This was a real pleasure of ours, guys. Let us know if we can ever do anything for you.
Well, in 6 months, maybe you want to come back and tell us how it's going.
Absolutely.
We'd love to.
Okay.
And if you want to come to Chattanooga,
I do.
It's a good place.
Doors open.
It is right now on
Right
my
here.
bucket list.
But I'm not coming now. It's in a bit.
You guys have no idea.
When the liquor stick comes, you can come.
Okay.
Excellent.
No idea what you mean to us.
Okay.
And we search for things so many places. For what little we have done, you guys are affecting change across the world. And we are so forever grateful for you guys. And I mean that.
Well, I'd love to have you in my class, David.
Thank you.
I'd like to be in your class, David.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
I have more questions for Daniel.
For me.
You can ask Daniel questions now. Yeah.
I was taking notes, Daniel.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And I'll be right back.
Bye.
So you talked about phases.
Yes.
Okay. In my mind, you have your perspective is people who are coming to the hospital. Okay. Do these same phases don't apply to, 80% of the cases out on the street, do they, or do they?
So I'm going to say yes. I mean, I'm in an, I think, interesting. I won't use the word unique because it wouldn't be used appropriately. But I'm fortunate in having my feet in several different arenas, and so some of the earliest exposure I had to COVID was in the outpatient setting in the urgent cares. And, we were involved, ProHealth, that was our Westchester patient. But actually, even before the Westchester patient, there was an individual I saw with a friend of mine, Adam Fitterstein, and it was in the Little Neck Clinic. And this individual had been to not the famous scientific conference, but some other conference, and had sat across the table from someone. And this individual first tested positive for the flu and, not a big deal. But I just didn't buy it. I had Adam go through the whole process. We procured a COVID test before we had anywhere to run it, put it on ice. And then later it turned out that person had COVID. But I was starting to see patients in the outpatient setting and the urgent cares before the hospital. And then I continued to have a lot of communication with a lot of the primary care doctors because we set up at ProHealth all these urgent care centers and all these drive-throughs. And as a lot of clinician offices were closing down and patients couldn't be seen, if anything, we were ramping up and giving a place for these people to go. And yeah, the doctors I think I've talked about were in the space suits, right? They were in these yellow Tyvek type suits. They were being sprayed down between patients, but we were seeing the outpatients. And then we would keep in touch with these individuals who tested positive by telephone, and we would go through. And I think in general, there are asymptomatic people who they have no symptoms, right? So you don't really see this. but sometimes you do, and I'll get into that. But these individuals might have that crummy week where they feel sort of, virally. But even the people that don't come in, they have a second week with the shortness of breath. Then, and this is the people that didn't even have much to begin with, they might show up just during that third week because they had a stroke. And then you trace back the exposure and you realize that, those symptoms were pretty mild during the first and second week, but that stroke is pretty prominent now. And then the kids, right, as we see, they're having that fourth week, hyperinflammatory phase. So I think it's a question of how significant each one of those phases is for a different individual. But I think we see this in outpatients as much as inpatients.
So it strikes me that the coagulopathies are maybe one of the trickiest things to deal with, because do you have any way of anticipating whether any sort of diagnosis you can do to try and anticipate whether a person is actually going to need therapy for this? I think you spoke about this. I mean, one might be inclined even to go in prophylactically and treat somebody. What do you do?
Yeah. So, this is one of those, I hope people get the frustration I have with the fact that we're in August and we have such limited guidance. Because honestly, it's hard for me. I mean, I actually, each patient that I take care of, I view them, well, some of my family members I don't like so much, but my connection with the patient, if you become my patient, I really care about your outcome. And so to give like a concrete example, my father's lawyer developed COVID back during this, and he went through the phases. He had the first crummy viral week. We checked in each day. Then he had that second week where I wasn't sure if he was going to make it to the, make it through without ending up in the hospital. So I would call, and I was really listening to how many words in a row before he had to take a breath. Made it through that second. And during the third week, he ends up with a clot in his leg. And so, at that point, he coordinated with his primary care doctor who recommended aspirin. I have no idea if that was the right thing, but that's what we did. The antiplatelet effect, and then he ended up eventually getting better, but there was a slow recovery there. So here's an example of an individual who never ends up in the hospital, has that clot. But how do you figure out who's going to have a clot, who's not going to have a clot? Because everything we do has potential side effects, and it's really hard to make these decisions. So you give someone aspirin, you say, just take an aspirin. It's no big deal. But 1% of people who take aspirin are going to end up with a GI bleed. And you want to send someone to the hospital with a GI bleed during a COVID pandemic. That's not great. So it troubles me that particularly this population that never ends up in the hospital, I don't see a lot of good randomized control trials going on looking at, do you give them an aspirin? Do you do something else to prevent that third phase? What exactly are the numbers to do the math? Even if you say, okay, your risk is this of getting a clot based on these parameters. So if someone was obese, if someone had other things, we're now making it sort of individual clinical judgment, which I say, yeah, that's great. Based on what? What is helping guide you?
Well, that leads into my last question, because you touched on this about how you, as physicians, you seem to be doing better, okay, but you don't necessarily know why in terms of controlled trials and stuff. And I wonder if anybody is doing or has in mind doing some sort of a study to look at outcomes in different hospitals, to see whether some hospital setting is doing better than another, and if so, try and dissect what's going on.
Yeah. So that data actually, interesting enough, right? We saw all that published in the New York area from the different health systems, right? So you had how's NYU doing? How's Cornell doing? Which is part of the NYP system. How is Northwell doing, right? Northwell did not look very good, but then they went and said, we just didn't present the data right. So, but then you had other people like, the patients are being discharged. And then someone's like, but they're being like, you're doing tracheotomies and sending them to, outpatient ventilator. Does that really count as a proper discharge? And then we do know, if you look at different hospitals, because we have all this data, that if you're at a hospital where the patients are older, where you have more non-Caucasian patients, your outcomes are worse. So there's something tricky about looking at this data. You have a hospital on the Upper East Side of New York with a lot of rich white people, your outcome's going to be a lot better than you go out to like Plainview, New York. We have a large Italian, Hispanic, older population.
Okay.
So some of the stuff is a little tricky to sort out. I mean, some of the stuff we know is true. Older individuals do worse, right? So if you want to do well, just, admit a whole bunch of healthy young people. But we did see over time, things did seem to get better, right? In March, the outcomes were terrible. By the time you get into April, the mortality is much lower. And, we're not under surge conditions, so that's clearly true. But it's very hard to know because as it's getting better everywhere, you have to be really careful with a lot of these historic controlled cohort studies. You really need proper randomized controlled trials. So you know that your intervention is what makes a difference. And it's not just that, we were pretty darn stressed emotionally, et cetera. I mean, I know in a New York Times article, one of the researchers says, I've been working 18 hours a day. And one of the ICU docs says, I've been working 18 hours a day and then like crying in my car at the end of those 18 hours as I watched people die in front of me. I mean, doctors now are in a much better place emotionally as well as resource wise. So there's so many different variables. And without the randomized controlled trials, it's really hard for us to know, is it delayed intubation? I think. Is it steroids? There's some support. Is it remdesivir? Yeah, not really. Is it something else? So
now really you've got the entire continent of Africa to deal with as well, because people aren't dying the same rate as they are here, and it's a conundrum as we speak. Is it genetics? Is it a different strain of virus? Is it
no?
Is it diet? Is it anything? What are you saying? No, you didn't go there yourself, did you?
I think you mentioned.
Have you been to Africa?
I think you mentioned mutant viruses again.
Dixon.
And that's, I'm going
to
be as upset as Vincent.
Come on,
that was the trigger.
Yeah.
Well, there's no explanation for this yet.
Yes, but don't invoke a strain of virus. There's zero evidence.
I said, is it? I didn't say it was.
Yeah, but
you have to
Dixon,
listen carefully. I said, is it?
Dixon, this is
I think some of the social stuff we talked about last time might be going on there, and access issues.
Yes, Dixon,
yeah, and it's hard to know. And all I remember the first time I was working in Nepal, and apparently there was no HIV in Nepal when I was working there, and zero people were dying from HIV. But boy, I saw people that if I had a blood test, I would have changed those numbers. So you really got to watch numbers coming out of these places, right? Because how much do you trust those numbers? Time will tell. In all honesty, I know everyone's been talking about how great the numbers are in the U.S. Unfortunately, the numbers are going to start going back to the CDC, and then if I see them going down, I'm going to feel better. But if you don't have good data, it's hard to make a good conclusion.
So
Daniel, you've referenced.
Go ahead, Rich.
You've referenced a New York Times article several times, and I'm not familiar with it. Can we put it in the show notes or something?
Yeah, we should do that. I think I put it in the show notes, or I gave the title last time, but it was a New York Times article, the COVID drug wars that pitted doctor against doctor.
Okay.
Now, what's your name? Dixon, what did you want to say?
Yeah, I wanted to... I get this all the time.
Go ahead.
The question I have for Daniel is, what is the lowest price per test that your organization offers that's reliable?
Yeah, so it's tricky because it's the lowest, what's the lowest cost to us of performing a test as far as reagents and things. And
yeah, exactly.
And this is tricky because we had a, supposedly I'm on vacation, but on Monday I was meeting with the National COVID Advisory Group for United Health Group. And we were talking about the Yale test, right? This wonderful.
Yeah.
We figured out it would cost us well over $100 per test performed, because there's, they were saying basically this is $10 a test is like saying a pair of shoes is only as much as the shoelaces because everything else is reusable, but you still have to buy those shoes, and those shoes don't last forever. And, and a lot of these tests, this is the Ford thing. The parts to his cars cost so much, but his big cost saving was he could automate things.
Sure.
And so for us, what's critical in the cost of different tests is, can you automate them? Because people actually expect to be paid, and they want medical benefits and all that good stuff. And so if you can't automate a test, it becomes really expensive to get it through. So, the Abbott ID now, the cost is about $40 a test. Some of the PCRs, once you have everything set up and you've bought your really expensive machine, the reagents might cost you $30 per test that you run through there. But you got to make that big investment of, buying these machines. You've got to make the, maintenance contracts. You need the space. You need, the staff you're paying to get all your approvals in place. So, the charge per test like this, right now we're sitting close to this $100, but the cost to the individual, and I think I mentioned the 2 federal acts, should be zero.
Correct.
If you get a test, the cost to you should be zero. Exactly. And then, how much the different companies get paid is really, a question. Their profit is going to be how much they can cut out all the waste and how efficient they can make the process. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. It's, I think I was going to say, and this is a big issue for the schools, because I know I talked to the schools like, oh, we have no money in the budget. And I'm like, you shouldn't necessarily be paying for tests. Why would you step in and pay for something that right now is free for your students and staff? You just need to work with the organizations that can do the testing. Your school, you educate people, you don't do testing. So sometimes when the schools try to take something more on, I think it's tricky because there's a lot involved in testing. There's not only getting the test, but what happens, as we talked about, you get a positive test, what's the positive predictive value? What's the regional prevalence? What do you tell that person? How do you get them linked into care? So,
but I agree that the test should not cost you anything, but how often should that be? I mean, you should be, depending on what you're doing, you should be tested 3 times a week, right? Is that kind
I think that's minimum, right? We've talked about different scenarios of getting back to work, and a production company like Lionsgate, they're going to really want frequent testing because for them, the risk benefit, the financial gain is huge. What we did right at the NHL was you had really careful testing as you entered the bubble. And that was really critical. So you don't need to do as many tests as long as you're really critical as far as, you get a full 14-day quarantine, you need a negative test after that, and then you can enter the bubble, but you can't leave. Schools have talked about doing these 7-day on and 7 days off, which is really 5 days on, and you've got weekends on either side. We did that at ProHealth back in March. And actually, it was a little frustrating because I was trying to do a randomized control trial to see in this high-risk urgent care population of providers, did that protect them in any way? But nobody got sick. And so thwarted my test, thwarted my randomized control trial. So there are ways to look at cohorting and time in and out, and that can affect how often you need to do the testing. But it's when you start looking at the expense, you start doing millions of tests, that I think the federal government may need to rethink their funding. So
is anybody pooling samples and running them like Michael Mena said to do? That'll save money.
So the pooling sample is, and I think we might get to this actually, but the FDA approved pooling of samples, but there actually was a recent change, and this came from an executive order from Trump, basically saying you don't have to go through the full FDA approval anymore. If you have a test that you think works, go ahead and start doing it. So you can pool samples all of a sudden, and then go to the FDA later. And if you think about the math, right, every time you pool a sample with one other person, that's an extra cycle. That's an extra CT value. So if you pull it with one other person, that's 1 CT. You pull it with 4 people, it's 2. You pull it with 8, it's 3, right? So that's about a 10-fold difference in sensitivity. So if you got a test that's like a hologic Panther down to 1,000 and you pull 10 people, your sensitivity is still at 10,000 of anyone in that sample. So you can really pool, 100 people and still pick out anyone infectious in a pool of 100. So the pooling, the math basically makes it work. And so there is pooling that's approved under FDA EUA, but now there's pooling is permissible with this sort of expansion of how you can do testing.
It makes
a lot of sense.
I wanted to ask you about that. The FDA announced It's called Rescission of Guidances and Other Informal Issuances Concerning Pre-Market Review of Laboratory Developed Tests. So basically, executive order, the FDA will not require pre-market review of laboratory developed tests absent notice and comment rulemaking, as opposed to through guidance documents, compliance manuals, website statements, or other informal issuances. So what do you think of that, Daniel? Overall.
Yeah, I think that this is going to improve access to testing, and it's going to really speed up innovation. I remember when on TWiV, my favorite podcast, well, second favorite after This Week in Parasitism,
of course,
which should be called Parasitology, by the way. But anyway, there was a whole discussion about, hey, the FDA, we did great. The pandemic hit here. By the end of April, we had all this testing availability, and I was like, oh my gosh, 2,000 people were dying a day. By the end of April, 2,000 people had died a day for weeks and weeks and weeks, and so for me, that was not quick. And so anything we can do to speed up access to testing, the testing is going to require a little more intelligence on the part of the people doing those tests, interpreting those tests. That's what we're here at TWiV to hopefully provide, is we'll go back and we can always, as the questions come in, and that was our guidance this time, think about different tests, think about what question they're answering, because the more testing we have available, the more options. I think that's going to allow us to hopefully test our way out of our current situation.
Right. Daniel, what do you think about this story in the Times 2 days ago? Basically, FDA was about to issue an EUA for convalescent plasma, and then both Fauci and Collins said, just wait. We don't think the data are that good. What's your thought about that?
I get a little bit of hate mail, and I think you're just asking me to get more as I weigh in on this. I never thought I would get hate mail, but some people apparently are not as enamored with me as other people. And, the reality with plasma, I know that it's not everyone, but I know that there are countless physicians who are just convinced it obviously works. We have one randomized control trial that did not show a benefit. We have the study we talked about last time, which is really not compelling. This is it's a resource-rich endeavor. It potentially has harms. It's not clear to me that we have any compelling evidence that it makes a difference. So again, don't just start giving everyone something that we do not know makes a difference. So I'm going to say I agree with my colleague who has a laryngeal polyp. That's Anthony Fauci.
That's right.
That, there is no compelling evidence at this point that plasma works. And I don't say it. There's nothing partisan about that. I, as a physician, treat patients. I am desperate to know when I'm looking that person in the eye and talking to them about treatment options, to know what can I offer that's going to make a difference, that will do no harm. And we don't have it. And you know what? Instead of spending all our resources on giving people a therapy that may or may not help, let's spend resources on doing those trials, doing proper trials, getting people in those randomized control trials, not giving them some expanded access to an unproven therapy.
The thing I get to go first this time, Rachel.
Okay.
So my feeling is that this is not a useful intervention for someone who's already sick, but it may be a prevention of infection in normal people. If you could give them immune, let's say monoclonal antibody, which you could show in another test system protects against the infection. The half-life of antibody is 6 months or something like this.
You're going to give it to them intravenously before they're sick, right?
Well, if I were a football player and I wanted to play football, goddamn right. If I'm a physician that wants to see people that have this disease all the time, and
let's ask Daniel. Daniel, what do you think about giving widespread people monoclonal antibodies intravenously before they're even sick? Is that a good idea?
To keep them from being sick. That's right. As a prevention.
That's what I said. That's what I said.
So I'm going to say
that's what you said.
I'm going to say I think it needs to be studied. As we saw, I like to use the Ebola example. There were 4 different, monoclonal cocktail mixes that could be tried. Only one of them had any efficacy. The other 3 had no efficacy. So what you think is going to work. will not necessarily work. And you need to know, right? I mean,
Of course.
false sense of security, right? Give someone a condom with holes in it. Like, that's worse than not giving them anything. And so I don't want to go and see patients with a false sense of security thinking I can pick up my N95 and scratch my nose. I want to know. And the same for, I guess you want to give it to football players, the Fighting Irish, of course, to get them back out there. But, I hate to say it. It's a very simple concept. I think we get back to, if you're going to do something, you want to know if it works. And there are ways to find out if things work, and you got to do them. You can't just, look at your magical ball and decide ahead of time.
And may I point out, please, that cocktail that worked for Ebola, one of the antibodies was not neutralizing. It had some other effector function that they didn't know about, but all the newts we're going after now are neutralizing. That's how they're doing it. And maybe that's not right. Just saying.
It's almost like this quote from the Times article. The three of us are pretty aligned on the importance of robust data through randomized control trials, and a pandemic does not change that. From Dr. Lane from this article is exactly what Daniel's getting at here.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, are there risks associated with plasma therapy? Number one. And number two, is there any reason a priori to believe that treatment with a monoclonal antibody would be more effective than plasma therapy?
Yeah, so I'll hit on the risks first, and this was something we saw firsthand. Is I saw a number of individuals receive this late in the therapy, so they're in week 3, they're in the hypercoagulable phase. We're struggling with elevated D dimers and clotting, and plasma is not serum. This is rich with clotting factors. So you're basically giving a hypercoagulable person a nice bolus of clotting factors while they're in the hypercoagulable phase, while they're on blood thinners.
Yeah, no, it's not.
And I just, because I had the ability to just sort of watch these people, within the next 3 days, 90% of them, their D dimers tripled. So this is not without harm.
Monoclonal therapy?
Different.
So the monoclonal therapy won't have the clotting factors. It's going to be given, and hopefully, and I think the trials that we're seeing roll out and the trials I'm hoping to support are going to be early on, when it's theoretically an antiviral. So you want to give it during the viral period. So that first, we'll say 7 to 10 days, particularly the first 7 days. And it's not the first 7 to 10 days after a positive PCR. It's really got to be intelligent about, this is disease onset. This is where that viral replication is going on. Those should be much lower risk, but it depends how they're made, right? We have a lot of different antibodies. Some are completely humanized. Some are chimeric, where there's a mouse part of it, but they tend to be pretty safe compared to some of these other therapies.
And of course, it depends on the antibody itself, its specificity and stuff. And as Vincent just pointed out, that to some extent is going to be a crapshoot.
Sure. And wouldn't those also be much more expensive and potentially have, issues in terms of storage and things like that, at least from some of the other monoclonal antibodies people take?
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue, I think, is the cost point, in all honesty. So people may or may not know, but I was involved in the development of denosumab, right? Prolia. Both my mother and mother-in-law take that. And yeah, these are not cheap. This is not like dexamethasone. This is not pennies a day. And so it's a bit of an issue. And I always, I always hate the fact that there might be a therapy that is restricted to certain socioeconomic brackets, parts of the world. So
actually, we've got a letter coming up that we won't get to this week that has refers to a paper about high affinity single chain antibodies that looks very interesting. I think
next week.
Well, that's right.
Speaking of,
and I think this is what vaccines are supposed to be about, right? This is supposed to be potentially at some point a low cost ability to give everyone those wonderful antibodies,
vaccines,
but not charge them hundreds of dollars for that,
and give everyone the ability to have their own B cells make those antibodies over time, and not worry about the half-life of those antibodies too.
That's right.
Yeah, and give them some memory too. Yeah, that vaccines are wonderful. Stay tuned. Speaking of speaking of social inequities, I wanted to briefly mention a morbidity and mortality weekly report from last week, which is relevant to our TWiV with Robert Fullilove. plein d'amour. Racial and ethnic disparities among COVID-19 cases and workplace outbreaks by industry sector in Utah. Really interesting study. So here, 12% of confirmed COVID-19 cases in Utah are associated with workplace outbreaks. That's 1,300 out of 11,000. The 210 workplace outbreaks occurred in 15 of 20 industry sectors, and nearly half in these three: manufacturing, construction, and wholesale trade. 24% of Utah's workforce in all 15 affected sectors identified as Hispanic or Latino or a race other than non-Hispanic, white. 73% of workplace outbreak-associated COVID-19 cases were in persons identified as Hispanic or non-white. 73%, even though only 24% of the workforce is Hispanic, non-white. Systemic social inequities have resulted in overrepresentation of Hispanic and non-white workers in frontline occupations with exposure. And that's what Bob Fullylove was talking about. And this is
the same is true for migrant workers, both in California and in Texas. So.
Yeah.
So what impressed me about this, among other things, if I understood it correctly, is that even within a given sector or workplace, there are what I would call maybe micro inequities or micro environments where the frontline within an industry, the frontline workers are more predominantly these underrepresented minorities, okay, and are more exposed. So the exposure difference, there's an exposure difference within an industry. It's incredible.
It's amazing.
Yeah. So all jobs at a particular place are not equal risk.
That's right.
Right. Just because you work in construction, there's a bunch of different ways to be in construction. Some are more riskier than others, and the minorities occupy the more riskier jobs.
That's right.
Let's wrap up with a couple of email questions for Daniel. The first one is from Tom. My father was infected with SARS-CoV-2 at the end of May, had a relatively mild second week before suffering an AFib episode at the beginning of the third week. He was hospitalized, had an initial positive PCR, 2 days later negative. During the fourth week, he had a cardioversion procedure, which put the heart back in sinus rhythm. This week it was discovered that he was again in AFib. He was hospitalized, given a second successful cardioversion procedure. My question is, what is the current understanding of the relationship between AFib and COVID-19, and what course of treatment has been successful on an evidence or observational standpoint?
Oh, this is a great question. And it brings up actually something that we're seeing more and more information about in the literature. And cardiac involvement is actually a pretty significant part of COVID-19. And so the myocardial inflammation, there was a study I think that I mentioned in one of my prior TWiV appearances. And so people are having arrhythmias. This is actually increased incidence in COVID. Atrial fibrillation, AFib, is actually one of the most common arrhythmias that we see as people get on in years. We are actually seeing, and there was actually a nice sort of a really personal story about a clinician, right, who had COVID, was out of work, and when they went to work, they realized, my gosh, I'm having trouble here at work, with exertion, and they went and got an echocardiogram, showed that their ejection fraction was about half of what it had been before. It's interesting they happen to know what their ejection fraction was, but we had enough time that a couple months went by, and the person, increased their exercise level, and the cardiac function returned to normal. So we're starting to get enough track record here that we're starting to see that cardiac involvement, inflammation of the myocardial myocardium. It's a heart muscle. And arrhythmias are a part of COVID-19. A lot of individuals, it looks like, will spontaneously recover. Again, this is going to be where we as clinicians are going to be needing to work with the researchers, those following these cohorts, giving us the numbers. What percent will get better? I hope it's 100. We'll keep that optimism until I'm dissuaded. But yeah, what's the course of treatment right now? Time is the biggest thing. A lot of people with atrial fibrillation, particularly in this context, it would be recommended that they would be on anticoagulation therapy during this period of time. And then it's going to be reassessed. Do they have recovery? So.
Okay. Brianne, can you take Dana's?
Sure. Dana writes, "Hello, I am a pediatrician from Fort Myers, Florida, writing to you on behalf of my group, Physicians Primary Care of Southwest Florida. School here is starting August 31st, and we want to have criteria for patients returning to school after mild viral symptoms. We feel that with mild viral symptoms, resolution of fever, and a negative rapid antigen test, the child could be deemed non-infectious and be cleared to return to school, rather than waiting out the 10-day quarantine every time there is a runny nose, which would keep many children out of school and parents out of work. Based on the information you have provided on your podcasts, even though the sensitivity of rapid tests is not perfect, it probably detects those children who are likely to transmit infection well enough to be used as a screening tool to send children back to school. I'm guessing every pediatric group and every school district is going to be faced with this exact challenge once school reopens, and it would be great to have national guidance based on science. We would love to know your thoughts. Thank you so much in advance and for all the excellent, informative podcasts. Sincerely, Dina."
It's for you, Daniel.
Okay. I was gonna leave that to someone else's
Next
lap.
question, please.
No.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, no. So, I think you have to be careful here. It is, and I think the science is evolving, and I think you're right, actually, online with where the science is headed here. So, what do? Kids will have fevers, kids will have colds, kids will have all these other things. Critical here is to identify this mild viral syndrome. Is it COVID or not? If it's not COVID, then you're just fine. When the child no longer has viral symptoms, then it's good to go. Pretty soon, we're also going to want to know that they don't have RSV or influenza, which I don't know we were ever as careful about as we probably should have been. But this could have a big positive impact, not only on our schools, but also on all of us. Right? We now realize that RSV in an adult is actually worse. Respiratory syncytial virus is worse than the flu. Right? So you miss a lot of work as a parent. Kids miss a lot of school with RSV, with influenza. But right now, the criteria, the guidance is you find out if it's COVID. If it's COVID, then there's this 10-day quarantine. If it's not COVID, then as mentioned, you're fine. Make sure it's not something else. We are working towards, and it would be great actually to be able to have some ability to test and say this person is no longer infectious and get them back working. And I think one day we'll have that. We've talked about getting access to the CT values on PCR, and rather than just using a random cutoff, trying to actually say, oh, you're below a threshold, and then having the contact tracing and data to support that. We're not quite there yet, but I see where this is headed, and it makes sense to me. I would much rather use science, an individual CT value or some other cutoff when I return someone to a population than just looking at a calendar and hoping that this individual reflects the limited number of individuals that are out there in the literature.
Rich, can you take Michael's?
Michael writes, "Hello, professors at TWiV. My name is Michael, and my son is a graduate student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I've been recently listening to your podcast and was very pleased to hear you mention the work going on at U of I with their new saliva-based test and the protocols put in place for students."
Rich,
excuse me?
I think you...
I missed that, Daniel. You cut out on me. I've been recently... am I there?
Yeah, you're here.
I've been recently listening to your podcast. Was very pleased to hear you mention the work going on at U of I with their new saliva-based test and protocols put in place for students. My son participated in the testing trials over the summer and was very impressed with the ease of testing and the quick turnaround of results within 24 hours. Twice per week testing protocol is very welcome news to us parents, and I'm hoping other schools follow suit. I'm forwarding a couple of announcements to you as the test they developed just received FDA emergency approval and is now being considered for broader use here within the state. Keep up the good work and stay safe, Michael. And he provides a couple of links about the University of Illinois test. And we talked about this briefly. It's they developed it themselves and apparently recently got EUA approval. It's a saliva-based test. So the students just have to spit into a tube and then it goes into a central lab, I believe, at the university. And they process the results and they have all of the appropriate reporting stuff in place so that they can, process a campus of 50,000 students plus staff. It must be 10,000 staff twice a week.
It's great.
You got to be negative to go to school. It's amazing.
That's what everybody can do.
And I hope they're collecting all of the data that goes along with this that we can, in the end, see, how effective this actually was. Because we're all saying, twice a week. You got to do twice a week. Well, here's the experiment.
Right.
All right, Daniel, can you take Margaret's?
Sure. Margaret, I lost you guys. Let me see where I was. Margaret writes, school nurse from MA reaching out. First, I love your podcast. You are all so brilliant. I understand a solid 50%, LOL. My question is about last week's show, talking about testing in the tri-state, the 50 rapid testing sites. That's a spit test, right? As a district, we've been quoted $50 per person testing with the Broad Institute to test all kids/staff. 1 times equals 200K. Are there other options I can introduce to my administration team? Any advice or where to go would be extremely helpful. Thanks for your help and stay well. So, she's actually up at the Peabody Concord Middle School. So that's Massachusetts. So what I'll say, Meg, is what we've got going here in the tri-states, the New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut area, is a combination of the rapid. At this point, it's the Abbott ID Now, because as mentioned, there's an issue getting access to the BD strips because the government has decided to buy all those. But what we're actually doing is working with a lot of schools. And what we're trying to do, at least what I'm trying to do from my end, is try to create a zero cost option. I mean, $200,000, I'm not sure where you get the money from, but basically creating access to testing for staff, teachers, students. It's really a question of how much do you want, but we've created this Let's Get Back program. And if you reach out, we can always connect you with them. But we're only in the tri-state. We're not in I guess we should move into the 4-state area, but I'm not sure what the quadri-state area. But yeah, that would be my advice. I'm not really sure where you're going to come up with, this, because school budgets are already tight. And so what we've been trying to do is actually not charge schools, but try to create access. And if it's just, we're going to create a phone number, we'll work with you to set up mobile testing at your schools. We'll try to work with you to figure out how often you need the testing. But yeah, I know that the Broad Institute has reached out to a lot of schools. And originally I had heard a lot of the universities in the Boston area were going to use them. And then most of them seem to have dropped their contracts. And I don't know if it's this cost issue because the way it should be is that a person should be able to get a COVID test in the United States with zero cost. So I'm not sure why it should be costing hundreds of thousands of dollars.
I have just one little correction here. If you're in the Boston area, it's not Peabody. It's Peabody.
Peabody?
It is.
Peabody.
And also, someone wrote in, Daniel, and asked me to make sure you call it the Broad Institute.
Yes, it is the Broad Institute.
So it's the Broad. It's the Broad.
Yes, it is the Broad.
I wrote back.
And I got to start saying Massachusetts correctly.
That's right.
Anyway, one more email. Dixon, can you take the last one?
Lay writes, Dear TWiV Maestros, a microbiologist friend of mine shared with me your podcast a few weeks ago, and I am now officially hooked. I am but a humble cartoonist with a huge knowledge gap on the subject of virology, but I feel by listening to a group of experts that gap is slowly but surely filling up. On a professional note, I had never drawn a virus until the current pandemic, and doubt not many other cartoonists had either, but it has provided some real inspiration during a time when we can all use some more laughs. I've attached some pandemically inspired gags. Hope you enjoy them. Be sure to laugh a lot. I hear it's good for the immune system, though this claim has not been verified by the FDA. Cheers and thanks to you all. Lee Rubin. And then he says, P.S. If you're looking for some more laughs, I invite you all to a live viral event hosted by the what?
Virtual.
A virtual. I'm sorry, a virtual event. That's right. That's right. Daniel and I have the same disease. Event hosted by the Deadline Club of New York City, chapter of the Society for Professional Journalists, on August 25th. It's free and worth every penny. That's very funny. Yes, there will be more virus cartoons during the event. For details, see this. Viruses in petri dishes appear larger for a comedic effect. And then he has some comics that he shows, and I think they're all very cleverly done, although I see some similarities between his work and Gary Larson, and I'm sure you will too as you read through them.
Hey, Dixon.
Imitation is the highest form of flattery.
Dixon.
Yes, go ahead.
The one that with the two crows.
Yes.
It's pretty funny. One of them has a face mask, you see.
Wait, what's up? It's COVID, not Corvid. Well, don't I feel silly?
What's Corvid? What is
Those
Corvid?
are Corvids. That's the genus name for the crow.
Oh, okay. That's very
Actually,
good.
it's a family name. It's a family name. They're Corvids.
I like the one with the viruses in the petri dish, where there's one particle far away from all the others, and they're saying, "For the last time, you moron, social distancing doesn't apply to us. We are the virus."
That's good. I like it. Very good. All right. Thank you, Lee. All right. Thanks, everybody. This is TWiV 656. You can find the letters and show notes at microbe.tv/TWiV. If you have a question or comment, TWiV at microbe.tv. If you like what we do, consider supporting us at microbe.tv/contribute. Dixon Despommier is at trichinella.org, and the Riving Liver.
The river living? Vincent caught the disease. Oh, no.
TheLivingRiver.com. Yeah, over the internets. Can you imagine?
Tongue-tied-itis.
Thank you, Dixon.
You're welcome. This was informative and a lot of fun.
Hi, those guys from, the guy from New York State.
They were
Daniel,
great.
Yeah, he was good.
The couple was wonderful.
Yes, that was a lot of fun.
And I mean, on public radio or the podcast or whatever you're going to call this, thank you for the new earphones. They're wonderful. They fit nice and they don't irritate.
Let me correct you. They're headphones and they fit nicely.
Be nicely to Dixon.
Brianne Barker's at Drew University, BioProf Barker on Twitter. Thanks, Brianne.
Thanks. It was great to be here. I learned a lot today.
Very good.
Exactly.
Rich Condit's an emeritus professor, University of Florida, Gainesville, currently residing in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Rich.
Sure enough. Always a good time.
And Daniel Griffin, he is here at Columbia University, Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. He's currently not here, though. He's upstate New York. Thanks, Daniel, for joining us for the whole.
Hello, everyone. It was great to be on today, and thanks.
For the whole TWiV, not just the first 30 or 40 minutes. That was cool. I hope you liked it. Is this your first complete TWiV, Daniel?
You know, it's my first complete, and so I'm not even sure the etiquette at the end. Are we going to all say something about TWiV is viral, out of sync? And,
no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that.
It's different.
I missed that because the three of us struggle and we take multiple takes and we always drag it out too long.
This is true.
It's a
pleasure here to be for the whole time. It's unfortunate I won't be able to do this on any regular basis, but it was fun this time.
Yeah, we appreciate that on your vacation you decided to join us, so thanks a lot. I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.blog. I'd like to thank the American Society for Virology and the American Society for Microbiology for their support of TWiV, and Ronald Jenkins for the music. And I forgot, Kathy asked me to plug the ASV expert list. You go to asv.org. Okay, and if you scroll down, it says the latest from ASV, chat with a virologist. You click on it. They have a list of over 300 members. They say it's curated, who have volunteered to speak with educational organizations about virology, of course, in a virtual setting. I'm sorry I forgot Kathy, but you probably wouldn't even hear this part, so I'm off the hook. Oh, not really. This episode of TWiV was recorded, edited, and posted by me, Vincent Racaniello. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.